Section 12 of Psychological Types, or the Psychology of Individuation. Psychological Types, or the Psychology of Individuation by Carl Gustav Jung. Translated by Helden Godwin Baines. Section 12, Chapter 2.2. A discussion of naive and sentimental poetry. For a long time, it seemed to me as though Schiller's division of poets into naive and sentimental were a classification that harmonized with the points of view here expounded. After mature reflection, however, I have come to the conclusion that this is not so. Schiller's definition is very simple. The naive poet is nature, the sentimental poet seeks her. This easy formula is enticing, since it affirms two different kinds of relation to the object. It might also be put like this. He who seeks or desires nature as an object does not possess her. Such a man would be the introvert, and vice versa, he who already is nature herself, standing therefore in the most intimate relation with the object, would be the extrovert. But a rather arbitrary interpretation such as this would have little in common with Schiller's point of view. His division into naive and sentimental is one which, in contrast to our type division, is not merely concerned with the individual mentality of the poet, but rather with the character of his creative activity, that is, with its product. The same poet can be sentimental in one poem, naive in another. Homer certainly is naive throughout, but how many of the moderns are not, for the most part, sentimental? Evidently, Schiller feels this difficulty, and therefore asserts that the poet is conditioned by his time, not as an individual, but as a poet. Thus, he says, all poets who are really such will respectively belong to the naive or sentimental to the degree in which the quality of the age in which they flower, or mere accidental circumstances, exert an influence upon their general makeup and upon their passing emotional mood. Consequently, it is not a question of fundamental types for Schiller, but rather of certain characteristics or qualities of the individual product. Hence, it is at once obvious that an introverted poet, on occasion, can be just as naive as he is sentimental. It therefore follows that to identify respectively naive and sentimental with extrovert and introvert would be quite beside the point, in so far as the problem of types is concerned. Not so, however, in so far as it is a question of typical mechanisms. A. The naive attitude. I will first present the definitions which Schiller gives of this attitude. It has already been mentioned that the naive poet is nature. He simply follows nature and sensation and confines himself to the mere copying of reality. LC page 248. With naive representations, we delight in the living presence of objects in our imagination. Page 250. Naive poetry is a boon of nature. It is a happy throw, needing no bettering when it succeeds, but fit for nothing when it has failed. Page 303. The naive genius must do everything through his nature. He can do little through his freedom. He will accomplish his idea only when nature works in him as an inner necessity. Page 304. Naive poetry is the child of life, and unto life it returns. Page 303. The naive genius depends wholly upon experience, upon the world with which he is in direct touch. He needs succor from without. Page 305. To the naive poet, the common nature of his surroundings can become dangerous, since sensibility is always more or less dependent upon the external impression, and only a constant activity of the productive faculty, which is not to be expected of human nature, would be able to prevent mere material from committing him at times to a blind receptivity. But whenever this is the case, the poetic feeling will be commonplace. Page 307 FF. The naive genius allows nature unlimited sway in him. Page 314. From this definition, the dependence of the naive poet upon the object is especially clear. His relation to the object has a compelling character, because he introjects the object, i.e. unconsciously identifies himself with it, or has, as it were, a priori identity with it. Lévi-Brul describes this relation to the object as participation mystique. This identity is always derived from an analogy between the object and an unconscious content. One could also say that the identity comes about through the projection of an unconscious analogy association upon the object. An identity of this nature has always a compelling character, because it is concerned with a certain libido sum, which, like every libido discharge working from the unconscious, has a compelling character in relation to the conscious, i.e., it is not disposable to consciousness. The naive attitude is therefore in a high degree conditioned by the object. The object operates independently in him, as it were. It fulfills itself in him because he himself is identical with it. To a certain extent, therefore, he gives his function of expression to the object and presents it in a certain way, not in the least actively or intentionally, but because it is represented in him. He is himself nature. Nature creates in him the product. He allows nature to hold absolute sway in him. Supremacy is given to the object. To this extent is the naive attitude extroverted. B. The sentimental attitude. We mentioned above that the sentimental poet seeks nature. He reflects upon the impression objects make upon him, and upon that reflection alone is the emotion based with which he himself is exalted, and which likewise affects us. Here the object is related to an idea, and from this relation alone his poetic power is derived. LC, page 249. He is always involved with two opposing presentations and sensations, with reality as a finite boundary, and with his idea as an infinite. The mixed feelings that he provokes will always bear witness to this dual origin. Page 250. The sentimental mood is the result of the effort to reproduce the naive sensation in accordance with its content under the conditions of reflection. Page 301. Sentimental poetry is the product of abstraction. Page 303. As a result of his effort to remove every limitation from human nature, the sentimental genius is exposed to the danger of abolishing human nature altogether, not merely mounting, as he must and should, above every sort of defined and restricted reality to the farthest possibility, to idealize, in short, but even transcending possibility itself. In other words, to become fantastical. The sentimental genius forsakes reality in order to rise to the world of ideas and command his material with greater freedom. Page 314. It is easy to see that the sentimental poet, in contrast with the naive, is characterized by a reflective and abstract attitude towards the object. He reflects about the object because he is abstracted from it. Thus he is, as it were, severed from the object a priori, as soon as his production begins. It is not the object that works in him, but he himself is operative. He does not, however, work inwardly into himself, but outwardly beyond the object. He is distinct from the object, not identical with it. He seeks to establish his relation to it, to command his material. Proceeding from this, his separateness from the object, there comes that impression of duality which Schiller refers to. For the sentimental poet creates from two sources, namely from the object or from his perception of it, and from himself. The external impression of the object is for him not something unconditioned, but material, which he handles in accordance with his own contents. Hence he stands above the object, and yet has a relation to it. It is not, however, the relation of impressionability, but of his own free choice he bestows a value or quality upon the object. His is therefore an introverted attitude. With the designation of these two attitudes as introverted and extroverted, we have not, however, exhausted Schiller's idea. Our two mechanisms are basic phenomena of a rather general nature, which only vaguely outline the specific. For the understanding of the naive and sentimental types, we must call two further principles to our aid, namely the elements sensation and intuition. I shall discuss these functions in greater detail at a later stage. I only wish to say at this point that the naive is characterized by a preponderance of the sensational element, the sentimental by the intuitive. Sensation fastens to the object. It even draws the subject into the object. Hence, for the naive type, the danger consists in his subjection to the object. Intuition, being a perception of one's own unconscious processes, withdraws from the object. It mounts above it, ever seeking to command its material, and to shape it even violently in accordance with the subjective viewpoint, though without awareness of the fact. The danger for the sentimental type, therefore, is a complete severance from reality, and a going under into the fluid fantasy world of the unconscious. C. The idealist and the realist. In the same essay, Schiller's reflections lead him to a conception of two psychological human types. He says, "This brings me to a very remarkable psychological antagonism among men in an age of progressive civilization, an antagonism which, because it is radical and rooted in the innate emotional constitution, is the cause of a sharper cleavage among men than the accidental quarrel of interest could ever bring about. An antagonism which robs the poet and artist of all hope of making a universal appeal, although this is his task, which makes it impossible for the philosopher, in spite of every effort, to be universally convincing. Yet nonetheless this is involved in the very idea of a philosophy, and which finally will never permit a man in practical life to see his mode of action universally applauded. In short, an opposition which is responsible for the fact that no work of the mind and no deed of the heart can make a decisive success with one class without thereby drawing upon it a condemnation from the other. This opposition is without doubt as old as the beginning of culture, and to the end it can hardly be otherwise, save in rare individual subjects, such as have always existed and it is to be hoped will always exist. But although this lies in the very nature of its operation, that it frustrates every attempt at an adjustment, because no section can be brought to see either a deficiency upon its own side or a reality upon the other, it is nevertheless always a sufficient gain to follow up such an important division to its final source, and thus at least to bring the actual point at issue to a simpler formulation." End of quote. It follows conclusively from this passage that through the observation of antagonistic mechanisms, Schiller arrived at the conception of two psychological types which claim the same significance in his presentation as I ascribe to the introvert and extrovert. With regard to the mutual relation between the two types established by myself, I can endorse almost word for word what Schiller says of his. Schiller, in harmony with what I pointed out earlier, reaches the type from the mechanism, since he, quote, severs alike from the naive and sentimental character a poetic quality that is common to both, end quote. If we carry out this operation, we shall have to subtract the gifted creative character. Then to the naive poet there remains the hold to the object and its autonomy in the subject, while to the sentimental there remains the superiority over the object, which is expressed in a more or less arbitrary judgment or treatment of the object. Schiller says, "After this there remains of the former, the naive, nothing else theoretically, but a dispassionate spirit of observation and a solid dependence upon the equable testimony of the senses, and practically a resigned submission to the necessity of nature. Of the sentimental character there remains nothing but a restless spirit of speculation, which insist upon the unconditioned in all cognitions, and in practice, a moral severity which insists upon the absolute in every act of will. Whoever counts himself among the former class can be called a realist, and whoever numbers himself with the latter, an idealist." End quote. Schiller's further elaborations concerning his two types refer almost exclusively to the familiar phenomena of the realistic and idealistic attitudes, and are therefore without interest for our investigation. End of section 12.